It is time for another round of November Patreon birthday shoutouts. I have some patrons that didn't get their shoutout last time, and I definitely didn't want to miss them this time. So I want to say a very happy birthday to Christina, Justin from the Generation Y podcast, Tammy, Shelly, Brenda, and Sabrina. May this year be filled with success and happiness and all of the things that bring you joy. So from me to you, I want to say happy birthday. When a juvenile is charged with a heinous crime, the idea is to punish to rehabilitate and allow that child to live a healthy adult life. But are all crimes, even when they're committed by a 14-year-old, forgivable? And how soon should that forgiveness come? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines. We have another episode covering yet another case. A while back, I had a comment from a listener who said she liked my show because it was often as much a biography of the people involved as it was about a true crime case. And that's accurate in some episodes where I have a lot of background information, but in other cases, we focus more on the crime or the legal aspects. Now, this episode is kind of neither, but also kind of both. It isn't a deep biography in that we're not tracing step by step through anyone's life. And there was no trial here, so we're not going to get into the back and forth of testimony or appeals. Part of me wasn't sure that I should cover this case because the people involved have moved on and maybe it's time the media does likewise. But as I reflected on it, I think there's just some very important conversations we still need to have when it comes to juvenile offenders. And it's especially important as more and more minors are being charged as adults. I think in all cases we ask, is there ever redemption? Is it fair to continue to punish someone after the court system has released that person? But I think it may be even more important when we're talking about juvenile cases. I'm going to present what we know about the case and the aftermath with all of the context I can find, and then leave it to you to decide where you fall. This case is a question of whether or not certain crimes are ever forgiven, even after someone has done everything the law required for them to move on with their life. And we are going to start with Dorothy Dixon, who grew up in rural Oconee County, South Carolina. She was one of Samuel and Pearl Dixon's 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Her parents were farmers who were teenagers and young adults during the Great Depression, which took a huge toll on them. They were starting out their adult lives at a time when scarcity was the norm. This caused Samuel to become miserly, wanting to stash away as much money as possible just in case he needed it. The history of the Great Depression and how it links to hoarding both money and physical items is fascinating. And it's not just something that we see in retrospect. There were active attempts to end hoarding during the Great Depression and then into World War II. In some places, it was even illegal, like in Canada, to buy beyond your immediate need. The U.S. limited how much food grocery stores and restaurants were allowed to even have in stock. And social pressure in being labeled unpatriotic if you hoarded anything also played a factor. Clearly, it was a big enough problem that they needed information campaigns to stop it. But the deprivation during the Depression caused some people to still become pack rats, even after, because you just never know when you might need something. For Samuel, the thing he held on to was money, but to an extreme degree. He went too far, to the point that he saved money that they really should have spent on food and clothing and other things the children needed. Dorothy's brother Curtis later recounted times when they fashioned flour sacks into clothes, which was pretty normal in the 1920s and 30s. Some flour and feed sellers started purposely making their sacks out of a material that would work for clothing. It was a very smart thing to do at the time, but then sacks started turning to paper, and it fell out of fashion. The style and the quality of the sacks changed with it. And Samuel was having his children wear these flour sack clothing long after it fell out of fashion and when it was seen as a sign of poverty. And this is why I need a history podcast, because I could fill 30 minutes of this episode just talking about Depression-era hoarding and the evolution of flour sack clothing. But let's get on topic. Samuel was hoarding this money in a way that left his family with money saved up, but not the things they needed. And his constant stress over this uncertainty of the future also made him prone to lashing out at his children, putting them down and making them feel like they were no good. Dorothy's brother Curtis said that Dorothy had developed that same sharp tongue. Dorothy married Charles Grant, and they had 2 daughters together. Dana was born first when Dorothy was around 20, and Charles was about 25. And then about 8 years later, in 1976, they had Gina. Charles worked as a real estate broker and a civil engineer with the Department of Agriculture, while Dorothy worked as an executive assistant for the personnel department of a bank. And when Charles was in his early 40s, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had a long and painful battle ahead of him, and Gina and Dana had to pitch in to help around the house, particularly in the hours from when they got back from school until Dorothy got back from work. And some nights, Dorothy wouldn't come home until very late, or not at all, instead opting to go out after work. Now, Dorothy had always been a drinker, and that wasn't a secret to anyone. But the degree that it got worse during Charles's illness was not something a lot of people knew about. And then when he died in 1987 at the age of 44, it spiraled out of control. Dana was 19 at this point, and Gina was only 11. So Gina especially was at an age where she really needed her mother to help her through it, but that was not what she got. Dorothy started dating very soon after Charles's death, and the rumor was that she actually started dating before he died. I'm not bringing it up to besmirch Dorothy in any way, except something I read gave me the impression Gina may have been aware of that rumor. So true or false, it would have impacted her. But regardless, she did know her mother was dating after Charles's death because Dorothy would bring the boyfriends home. One morning, Gina reportedly woke up in the house, and the only person there was an older man that Dorothy had been dating. Now, the details are a bit vague here, but at some point, Gina realized that the man was not breathing. He had died suddenly in his sleep, and Gina, who is probably around 12 at this point, had to figure out how to deal with that, not just the emotional side of finding a dead man in her house, but also the practical side of who to even call about it. At some point after Charles had died, Dorothy did go to rehab to get her drinking under control. It's not clear how long she was sober, but when she did start drinking again, things seemed worse than ever. For some people who grow up in verbally abusive homes, they break the cycle and learn new ways of parenting their own children. But Dorothy, particularly when she was drunk, would fall into those learned behaviors. Dana was an adult at that point, which left Gina to be on the receiving end of Dorothy's tirades. But a lot of what was happening behind closed doors stayed there. Dorothy's alcoholism was clocked by a lot more people than she or her kids thought, but she was holding down a job and she kept most of her drinking to the hours she was home. So her angry rants at Gina, which sometimes included blaming Gina for Charles's death, were not seen or heard by the outside world. In 1990, Dorothy married a man named Sonny Mayfield, who was about 15 years her senior. So living at their house in Lexington, South Carolina was Dorothy, Sonny, Dana, and Gina. Dana was working as a nurse, and she had a lot on her plate. She was more or less running the household because though Dorothy had held down her job, she struggled to do much more. In spite of the turmoil at home, Gina seemed to be thriving at school. In the 8th grade, she had been elected the first female student body president of her school. She had just started high school in the fall of 1990, and she was playing on the tennis team. Gina seemed to be doing amazingly well, but there was one issue. She was 14, and she was dating a boy named Jack Hook, who was a 16-year-old football player who was the exact opposite of Gina. He was an okay student at best, and he already had a criminal record for some petty crimes. But Gina was completely smitten by him, much to Dorothy's disapproval. Gina and Dorothy's relationship did not need more conflict between them, but that is definitely what they got here. Gina's relationship with Jack was a huge source of tension between them, and it was the catalyst for a number of arguments. And that's what the two were arguing about on the night of Wednesday, September 12th, 1990. Gina was on the phone in her room with Jack while Dorothy was drinking to excess. Dana and Gina said that it was normal at this point for Dorothy to start drinking after work and just continue until she passed out at night. While Gina and Jack were on the phone, he could hear Dorothy in the background yelling at Gina. Gina didn't silently take it, she was arguing back a bit herself, and they were on the phone for about 20 minutes before they hung up around 9:30. Jack could still hear Dorothy ranting in the background when they hung up. A few hours after the call, so just a little past midnight on September 13th, Gina's sister Dana came home after work. When she tried to get into the house, the side door was locked. She checked the back door, and that was also locked, which was unusual. She knocked and called for someone to let her in, but no one responded. So she went around to the front door, which she did have a key to, and opened it. But she barely got the door cracked when someone shoved it closed from the inside. Not knowing what was going on and worried for her mother and sister who should have been home, she went down to the local gas station and called 911 from a payphone. Dana told the dispatcher what had just happened, and they sent a deputy over to check things out. He met Dana at the gas station, and they went to the house together. When they got there, Gina was outside with blood on her hands and her clothes. She was trying to flag someone down for help, and she was clearly agitated. All she said to Dana was that she and Dorothy had gotten into a fight, and Dorothy was hurt badly. She might even be dead. The deputy entered the house, and from the entrance, he could see blood in the hallway. Entering the dining room, he saw 43-year-old Dorothy Mayfield's body lying on the floor. Her head was bloodied, and there was a kitchen knife sticking out of her neck. Dorothy's arm was draped over her neck as though she had been the one holding the knife. But it seemed unlikely that she had stabbed herself. It was obvious that Dorothy had been dragged to that spot from the kitchen where the attack had actually taken place based on the blood spatter. This was so violent of an assault that the blood spatter even reached the cereal boxes on top of the fridge. It was later described by a detective as one of the top 3 most violent crime scenes he had ever seen. Dana and Gina were both taken to the station to be interviewed. Dana hadn't been home, so her statement was pretty short, but Gina sat down at around 2 a.m. to give a full account of the events of the night. This would be her first version of what happened. According to Gina in statement number 1, Dorothy had been drinking that night, as she usually did. She was very drunk and started in on Gina while she was talking to Jack in her bedroom. She hung up with Jack while Dorothy screamed that they needed to, quote, have it out about her boyfriend, and Dorothy threatened to beat Gina's butt to show her who the boss was. Gina came out of her room and saw Dorothy taking off her jewelry, and she started unbuttoning her blouse, saying something about how she didn't want to ruin her $300 suit. Dorothy then grabbed Gina, and the two had a physical altercation near the top of the stairs. Gina said she wasn't trying to fight, she was actually trying to get away from Dorothy, as Dorothy was hitting her on her back and shoulders. As they struggled, pushing and pulling at each other, Dorothy fell and hit her head, tumbling down the stairs. She seemed to have been knocked out, but when Gina got down there, Dorothy got back up, grabbed Gina by the neck, and said, quote, "One of us has got to go." Gina had no idea how, but suddenly Dorothy had a knife in her hand. Gina grabbed her arm to try to keep the knife away from her, but Dorothy was still coming at her. Gina was begging for her to stop, saying, "No, Mama, no." Gina managed to get free from Dorothy and took a big step backwards. Dorothy looked at her, repeated the line of "one of us has got to go," and then stabbed herself in the neck. This story seemed implausible, to say the least, and the investigators tried again, pushing at Gina to get to the truth. She reported the same sequence of events, except on 2 points. She added that Dorothy had also threatened to kill Jack, and she also admitted that the fight between her and Dorothy was probably even more intense and violent than she originally said, which might account for more of Dorothy's injuries. While Gina was at the station being questioned, there was a full forensic search of her home happening, and it was evidence found there that destroyed Gina's story. In Gina's closet, they found a plastic bag, and in that bag was a bunch of bloody towels and Dorothy's jacket, which was covered in blood. And then they found a bloodied, heavy crystal candlestick that had been wiped clean of fingerprints. It had been a birthday gift that Gina previously gave Dorothy. Gina was confronted with this evidence around 5 a.m. while she was still at the station, and now we get to the third story. Gina said that she hid the candlestick and didn't mention it to the police because she was afraid that they would think it meant she killed Dorothy, which she didn't. But she admitted that she had, at some point during their physical fight, grabbed the candlestick, and maybe she hit Dorothy with it. But she insisted the rest of the story was true. Dorothy had stabbed herself in the neck. She didn't really have a good explanation for why she moved Dorothy's body, or apparently used the bloody towels to clean the scene. Dana stepped in at this point, as she was the adult in Gina's life, and said Gina needed a lawyer, so the questioning stopped. Gina was then put under arrest and charged with Dorothy's murder. When the autopsy was conducted, it supported some of Gina's claims. For instance, Gina said her mother was very drunk, and she was. Dorothy's blood alcohol level was 0.3, which is very high. This is the alcohol poisoning range, and a lot of people would be vomiting and blacking out at this point. Dorothy, however, was an alcoholic, so her tolerance could have been higher, but regardless, this is a dangerous level for anyone. So that was in line with what Gina said, but then the autopsy disproved pretty much every other aspect of her story, and probably the most important one, the cause of death. Dorothy had not just fallen down the stairs and bumped her head. She hadn't just maybe been hit with a candlestick. She had sustained at least 13 significant blows that killed her, and the bloody candlestick appeared to be the murder weapon. Gina's story that she might have hit her mother did not align with this number of strikes. As for the knife in her neck, due to the lack of blood around the wound, it appeared she was stabbed after death. Beyond even that, there was at least one significant blow to the back of Dorothy's head. If they were in a physical altercation when Gina hit her in self-defense, they would have been face to face, so how did Dorothy get hit from behind? The police believed this autopsy completely destroyed Gina's story. But there was one aspect of the circumstances of the story the police still wanted to check out. So the morning of the murder, they went to interview Jack Hook at his home, largely because Gina said he was the catalyst for the argument with her mom. Jack confirmed that he was home the night before talking to Gina on the phone and that Dorothy was going off in the background about something. But he said he had no idea what happened after they hung up. He was as surprised as anyone that it had escalated to the point that someone had been killed. The police believed, based on the evidence, that Dorothy was drunk and she did yell at Gina that night. But the physical fight Gina described was fiction. Instead, they believed Dorothy had ranted at her daughter and then went down to the kitchen and was sitting at the table with her back to the room. Gina came up from behind with the candlestick and hit Dorothy on the head, angry and resentful about her mother's objections to her relationship with Jack. Dorothy turned around and tried to shield herself from the blows as Gina beat her to death. The knife to the throat may have been an afterthought, an attempt to stage a suicide, or maybe had been part of the plan. Dragging the body out of the kitchen and the shoddy attempt at a cleanup was also to stage the scene. But then, Dana came home from work, interrupting whatever was going on there. Gina had just enough time to hide stuff in her closet before the police arrived. Just because the staging of the crime seemed rushed and confused, the police didn't think that meant that this wasn't planned. After all, this was a 14-year-old, and as smart as a 14-year-old can be, they're just not sophisticated. They believe that Gina could have both planned this and executed it poorly. According to South Carolina law, Gina's name would be withheld from the media so long as she was being charged as a juvenile. If she was charged as an adult, that would change things, but at the time of her arrest, she was being processed through the juvenile system, so her name should not have been released to the media. However, the sheriff, clearly not a fan of the juvenile protections afforded to Gina, chose to release her name anyway. He figured the crime was of adult severity and therefore the consequences should match. And when Gina Grant's name hit the papers, it shocked the community. Some people even wondered if there was another Gina Grant in town because surely the Gina Grant they knew wouldn't have done something like this. She couldn't have. She was bubbly and popular and smart and sweet. She was a good kid, not the kind of kid to ever do something violent. Some of this belief was definitely owing to Gina's reputation and how she was known in the town of Lexington. But some of this was probably because she was just like everyone else's kids, and I doubt many parents want to walk down the path of considering what their children were capable of. Most people seemed willing to wait for more of the story to come out before they condemned Gina. The sheriff, however, believed that she was a cunning psychopath who had fooled everyone all of this time with her superficial charm. A couple of days after the murder, a second arrest was announced in the media. Though the candlestick had been wiped of prints, the knife handle hadn't been, and a print was lifted. That print was not a match to Gina. It was a match to her boyfriend, 16-year-old Jack Hook. Jack had already denied going over there that night, and he continued to do so after his arrest. He claimed that he had been there days before Dorothy's death, and they had used the kitchen knives to practice throwing knives at trees. That must have been how his print ended up on the handle of the knife. Now, the police didn't find this entirely believable because it would mean that Gina stuck the knife in her mother's neck without smudging Jack's print and also without leaving her own behind. The police did not believe Jack, and he was charged as an accessory. They believed that at the very least, Jack went to the house after the murder. He helped clean up, and he helped stage the suicide. In fact, staging a suicide may have even been his idea. Jack being implicated in this crime opened up a new statement from Gina. A month after the murder, Gina told the police she wanted to tell them what really happened. And in this statement, which is statement number 4, Gina said that she and Dorothy were arguing in the kitchen about Jack when Jack arrived at the house coming through the back door. When Dorothy saw him, she grabbed a knife and held it just inches away from Gina's face. Gina was yelling at her to drop the knife when Jack went into the den and came back with the candlestick in his hand. He raised his arm and hit Dorothy on the back of the head to protect Gina. Gina did not see what happened next as she turned away and just did not watch. But she could hear Jack hitting Dorothy while Gina herself was just screaming. When she finally looked up, she saw Jack shaking, saying, "Oh my God," over and over again. When asked why she came forward at this point with a new story, Gina said it was because if she didn't, she would end up going to jail for something she didn't do. The detectives then asked what happens if Jack does the same thing, tells the police that she did it so that he won't go to jail. And Gina said they'd have to decide who they believed. Jack's family heard about Gina's new statement, and they were extremely concerned Jack would go down for this murder. Gina was the golden child, both smart and sweet, and had a lot of community support. Jack already had a criminal record, so who were the police going to believe? It also seemed very strange that Gina came up with this story because she had previously called Jack's mom, Sheila, to tell her that Jack was completely innocent and that he hadn't even been an accessory to this crime. But now she was telling the police he was the killer. Jack's parents consulted his attorney, who very wisely advised Sheila to start recording any calls from Gina, because if Gina was telling the police one thing and telling Sheila something else, that would go a long way in protecting Jack in court. So Sheila started recording, and for Jack's sake, it's a good thing she did. Gina called Sheila a few times, and all were recorded. Gina could not keep her story straight on these calls. Sometimes she said Jack definitely wasn't there, and then sometimes she sounds like maybe he was there. Sometimes she thinks someone else, like a third party, had killed Dorothy, but other times she couldn't remember what happened. In one call, Sheila read Gina a letter that Jack had written to her. I imagine he wasn't allowed to send it directly to Gina since charged co-conspirators are often restricted from direct communication. So instead, he sent it to his mom, who read it to Gina over the phone. In it, he encouraged Gina to tell the truth because it would be better for her with the police if she was honest and forthcoming. He said he didn't know what happened that night, but it didn't matter because he still loved her, and he assured Gina he would stand by her side no matter what. But he said it wasn't easy for him being locked up for something he had nothing to do with. Gina listened as Sheila read this letter, and it doesn't sound like she had much comment on it one way or the other. She didn't say, oh no, he was definitely there, or of course he wasn't there. She didn't confirm or deny what he was saying. Later on in that same call, Gina did make a comment about how Jack could either turn on her and say she did it, or he could confess to doing it and make a deal for a reduced charge. Sheila was shocked at the suggestion that Jack confess, in her mind falsely, for any reason. She asked Gina straight out if Jack was there or not, pointing out that Gina kept going back and forth on this point. And Gina answered that no, he wasn't there. It seemed like Gina's plan wasn't to throw Jack under the bus so he would go down for this, but rather she was toying with the idea of confusing things. If she pointed the finger at Jack and then she got Jack to point the finger back at her, maybe it would cause enough confusion that they both got acquitted. But these recorded phone calls of Gina going back and forth on what happened that night meant this was never going to fly. Gina's defense, in the meantime, was leaning towards a different tactic: self-defense from an abusive, alcoholic mother. The issue was finding proof because, like a lot of abused children, Dana and Gina hid it the best they could. Covering up for Dorothy was one of the many roles they played in the family. Dana did back up Gina's account of the abuse, saying that Dorothy would fly off the handle when she was drunk and berate Gina. Like I said before, Dorothy would go as far as to accuse Gina with some frequency of causing her father's death, which was probably the most hurtful thing she could have said. And Gina even had the support of her extended family in this. Dorothy's mother and brother publicly supported Gina. Her brother Curtis even said he could understand why Gina snapped, as he had also grown up with a verbally and psychologically abusive parent. The family of Gina's best friend Christy also backed her up, though they didn't realize there was abuse going on until shortly before Dorothy's death, because they believed Gina when she gave rehearsed stories about random injuries. Bruises, those were part of being an active and athletic 14-year-old. An ankle injury that required medical attention, she fell down the stairs. A black eye, oh, Dorothy accidentally knocked into her. There was always an excuse. They did know that Dorothy was an alcoholic because as much as Gina and Dana and even Dorothy thought they were hiding it, it was obvious to anyone who came over to the house. As a result, Gina rarely had people over and instead spent as much time as possible with Christy's family. About a week and a half before Dorothy's death, Gina was with Christy's family at the lake for Labor Day and confided in Christy that she was scared of her mother. Dorothy's drinking had been getting worse, and Gina thought that she was also taking prescription sedatives along with the alcohol. The verbal abuse had turned into more physical violence, and she thought that one day, Dorothy might actually kill her. Christy told Gina they had to tell her mom, Eileen. Eileen took what she heard seriously, and she called the sheriff's office to report that there was abuse in the home and that the 14-year-old daughter believed she was in danger. Eileen was told that if she filed a formal complaint against Dorothy, Dorothy would know who filed it. Eileen was worried that this would put Gina in greater danger. Not only would Dorothy know that Gina disclosed the abuse, she would probably ban Gina from going over to Eileen's house, which was Gina's only respite. Eileen opted not to file the complaint at that time, and the officer who took the call thought it wasn't really anything, so she didn't even document it. She later confirmed to a journalist that the call happened, but at the time of the killing and in the legal aftermath, it was considered not verified. The state did not believe that the abuse in the home was behind the murder, but rather Gina's desired freedom to be with her boyfriend, Jack. A month before Dorothy was killed, Dorothy had called the police to report Gina missing. The truth was, Gina was out all night with Jack, but to try to get out of trouble, she told an implausible story about getting kidnapped. She claimed that she had been walking near the football field when a tall, fat, smelly man pushed her into his car and drove her around all night. That's it, just drove her around. Gina took this lie so far that she filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department, before later admitting she had lied. The state believed that Dorothy was cracking down even more on Gina to prevent her from seeing this older boy who she thought was a bad influence on her. The night Dorothy was killed, Gina and Dorothy argued over Jack for the millionth time, and this time Gina decided the only way to be with Jack would be if Dorothy was dead. They did wonder if Jack may have been involved in the actual plan, but the evidence didn't really help prove more than the accessory charge since Dorothy was stabbed after death. Gina's defense attorney, however, hoped he could explain a lot of what was really happening with Gina, including the lies, using the results of her psychological examination. For example, the police claimed that Gina seemed detached and did not express the proper emotions during this entire thing, from when the police responded to the scene to the multiple times she was interviewed. That's the root of the sheriff thinking she's a psychopath. But what they failed to realize that this was a child who was programmed to keep secrets even when they hurt her. People in situations like that often detach from their feelings when things are too overwhelming. It's a way of coping, and that's possibly what Gina had done. And yes, Gina came up with a number of stories to get out of trouble, but that's also something she was conditioned to do in an attempt to avoid Dorothy's wrath. The psychologist who examined Gina concluded that she did experience intense and extreme psychological abuse as bad as he had ever seen before, and he had examined other children who killed their parents, so he had experience specifically in this field. After the stories that Gina told, she ended up kind of landing on a claim of not really remembering what happened that night, so she underwent an examination with amobarbital, a so-called truth serum. It's a short-acting, powerful sedative, so it lowers inhibitions. Unfortunately, it can also lead to false memories being planted, and they don't use it so much anymore. But during this truth serum interview, Gina was able to give a few snapshot memories, like Dorothy grabbing a knife, Gina knocking it out of her hand, and there being a second knife at some point, or maybe she had picked up the first one again, and Gina also remembered reaching for the candlestick. These little bursts of memory didn't really help her case or the state's case, and didn't really uncover what had happened that night. As both sides were evaluating their cases, they came together to discuss the options of making a deal. The state thought this was a case of premeditated murder, but they knew that the evidence of the abuse against Gina could have led to an all-out acquittal. As the prosecutor told the media, people in South Carolina believe in self-defense, and if they bought Gina's story, even in part, There would be no justice at all if she was acquitted, in the state's view. The state was also charging Gina as a juvenile, which limited the sentencing options regardless of what she was officially convicted of. So making a deal for a lesser offense might not make a huge difference in how long she spent locked up anyway, and that would be better than her walking. The defense wasn't exactly confident in their case either, or at least not confident that the jury would give them an acquittal. They would have been more sure of things if Gina had consistently told the same story and just owned up to things while still saying it was self-defense. But she didn't do that. She tried to clean up the scene and hide evidence, and then she told the police 3 different stories in the first several hours after the murder. And then she tried to point the finger at her boyfriend in her 4th story. They worried that even if the jury believed Gina had been abused by Dorothy, they wouldn't believe she was in fear of her life at the moment. So instead of going to trial, Gina Grant, then 15, made a deal. She pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter, and separately, Jack pleaded no contest to the accessory charge. Sentencing for juveniles in South Carolina at the time was basically that they were turned over to a youth correctional facility until they were deemed ready to be released or they turned 21. It's up to the system if they would get out any earlier than their 21st birthday, though there are sentencing guidelines within that broad range. The judge in Gina's case, however, indicated that Gina should spend 9 months in confinement, which was only 6 more months when she got credit for time served, and then she would be turned over to her aunt and uncle who lived in Massachusetts. They had agreed to take custody of Gina and place her in a residential school for children with emotional problems. Not only would they supervise her, but they would also pay for the school. If Gina didn't get into the school in Massachusetts, she would have to stay incarcerated in the juvenile system in South Carolina. This ruling was not actually in line with the law, and the Department of Youth Services fought it. They said that it was within their discretion when Gina was released and not the judges. While they didn't try to argue that the placement in Massachusetts wasn't better for Gina, because it definitely was, they didn't want to set a precedent to allow a judge to determine when a juvenile offender would be released. But it wouldn't be a problem unless Gina got accepted into the school, which she did. So in August of 1991, with Gina ready to go to that school, the Juvenile Parole Board denied her release, saying that she had not taken responsibility for what she had done. In September, the judge overruled them, placing Gina on 2 years of probation with the understanding that she would reside at the school in Massachusetts. The Department of Youth Services continued to try to fight her release. A big part of the argument over this had to do with equity and privilege. The facility Gina lived in South Carolina was overcrowded, and it was also funded at taxpayer expense. So one less person living there and being supported by the state seemed like a good thing overall, but Gina was getting this opportunity only because her family had the money to pay for it. That was not an opportunity afforded to anyone else. But on the other hand, do we really make a 15-year-old not get the help she needed because not everyone has access to that help? And if we say yes, that is what we do, where do we draw the line? Do we not let O.J. Simpson have a dream team at trial because most people can afford that type of representation? While inequity in the system is a major issue at all levels, I feel like this approach is looking at it in the wrong way. And to illustrate this, let's go back to my 11th year in high school and the reading of Kurt Vonnegut's short story, Harrison Bergeron. It was set in a dystopian world where everyone was equal, but rather than raising everyone up to be equal, it pulled people down. So if you were intelligent, you had a radio in your ear that interrupted your thoughts to bring your functional abilities down. And if you were particularly strong, you would have to wear weights. So the question is, do we put weights on Gina Grant to force equity by averaging everyone out, or do we try to lift up all juveniles in the system to give them better opportunities and resources? Unfortunately, housing Gina until she was 21 was way cheaper than funding new buildings, new staff, and services to help all of the kids. So keeping her in South Carolina was the Department of Youth Services official stance. But she ended up getting released so that she could attend that school in Massachusetts. A month later, Jack was released on parole, which meant he spent a little more time locked up than Gina did, even though he pleaded out on a lesser charge. And that is where our story would end, except that Gina found forgiveness from the world a little bit harder to come by than from the juvenile court judge. Gina got to Massachusetts and moved into the residential school, but she only stayed there for a short time. One source said weeks, another said a couple of months. She moved in with her aunt and uncle and enrolled in the local public high school in Cambridge, but things in their home didn't work out either. No one has opted to share the details, but at 16, they had a large argument and Gina found an apartment of her own. She had some money that had been put in trust for her that she could live off of, so she was on her own after that. Gina applied for early decision to Harvard and got accepted with the intention to attend starting in the fall of 1995. She was the type of well-rounded candidate Harvard looks for. She had a high IQ, advanced academic performance, she was the co-captain of the tennis team, and she was someone who gave back. She volunteered over the summer to tutor underprivileged middle schoolers in science. And she did all that in spite of both of her parents having died by the time she was 14 and while living on her own since 16. Now, Harvard didn't know the specifics of the situation on how she lost her parents at 14, and neither did the Boston Globe. Gina's story of perseverance was such a great one that in the spring of 1995, when she was nearing high school graduation, the Boston Globe ran a feature called Beating the Odds. It profiled high school students who had overcome adversity, and Gina was one of the students highlighted. The article said that Gina's parents were both alcoholics and her father died of cancer, but said she couldn't talk about how her mother died because it was too painful. The article announced that she had gotten into her first choice school, Harvard. Gina was quoted as saying that she learned to be independent because life doesn't stop when your parents die. She went on to say, quote, "It's true that you can acknowledge bad things happen and that things are awful. But to feel I'm a victim, that's just not good," end quote. What happened next is a little fuzzy. The article ran on April 2nd, 1995, but 2 days before that, an envelope had been delivered to the admissions office at Harvard. Inside was a letter saying that Gina had hoodwinked them, and also in that envelope were newspaper clippings about the murder. A similar packet would also end up being sent to the Boston Globe as well. This envelope came just days before the article was published, but it does seem too big of a coincidence to not somehow be related. It's possible someone heard about the feature being in the works, and maybe the journalist had even reached out to the sender for comment. Or maybe someone told the sender of this letter about the article. We really don't know. Some places say the packet was mailed, and others say it was hand-delivered. Now, it would be odd if someone drove the 14 hours from South Carolina to Massachusetts to deliver the packet. So if it was hand-delivered, it was very likely someone already in Massachusetts, which would be a small suspect pool since very few knew her whole backstory. After receiving the packet and holding a meeting, the Harvard admissions officers decided to rescind their offer, stating that Gina had been misleading in her application to the college and during her interview when she didn't disclose her conviction. She asked for an opportunity to meet with them, but they declined. After this became public, Gina's attorney explained that Gina didn't think she had to disclose it. It was a juvenile offense, and it was considered a sealed matter. When she told an interviewer that her mother died in an accident, that was in line with what Gina believed she pleaded no contest to. Maybe this was a poor interpretation of what manslaughter means, but it was what Gina believed, according to her attorney. It has been reported that Gina specifically told the interviewer that her mother died in a car accident, though she denied that. Massachusetts law prohibits schools from asking questions of applicants about arrests that don't end in a conviction. And technically speaking, juveniles are not convicted of crimes. They are adjudicated delinquent. Therefore, by the letter of the law, Gina was within her rights to withhold this information. That's according to her attorney. Harvard, however, stuck by their decision, saying that Gina had lied and that was the reason, not the conviction. I personally feel they may have been splitting hairs here and looking for a reason not to let her in. Tufts University, which had also offered Gina admission, said they would stand by it. There was some protesting from a group of students about Gina's admission into Tufts, but the overall view of the student body was support or, more frequently, indifference. The news about Harvard rescinding their offer caused nationwide debate about juvenile offenders. It was so intense that the high school Gina graduated from just 2 months later had to hire security to keep reporters out. But it also stirred up conversations in South Carolina about Gina specifically. It doesn't seem like many expected to hear that Gina was no longer in the residential school that she moved to Massachusetts to attend. It surprised people to learn that from the time Dorothy had been killed until Gina was living in an apartment of her own with her trust fund was less than a year and a half. Even among those who had sympathy for Gina, it seemed like some of them didn't think she had been punished enough. But for her closest supporters and those who believed that she really was defending herself, they were glad to hear that Tufts had accepted her and she could move forward with her life. In spite of offers from publicists and agents to tell her story, Gina opted for a quiet life, finishing school and moving on to build the stable life she had always wanted. The question this case raises, though, is when is forgiveness achieved? Is it when someone completes their legal sentence, no matter how short it is? Or is this something that Gina and other people who have killed someone else will always have hanging over their head? Should this be something that should just always follow them? The more I've covered cases from other countries, the odder it feels to me that we know Gina's name at all. In 2006 in Canada, a 12-year-old girl killed her parents and younger brother, and her identity remains under seal. And Mary Bell, who killed 2 victims in the late 60s in the UK, has had a name change and a lifelong identity protection, so that she could go on and live life as normally as she could. Even if I knew the identity Mary Bell was living under, I would not be allowed to say it right now. As most of you have probably noticed in my episodes, I often change or omit the names of minors. And I considered doing that here. This is a case where I normally would have changed Gina's name as she was a minor, except it would be pointless. It's already out there on a much greater scale, including the recent republication of a New Yorker article on the case. At some point, it becomes performative to change the names, and I think this case is one of them. But I'm curious your opinion on where we draw the line in letting people move on from their past, from their crimes. Or are there just some crimes, no matter the age of the offender, that should be punished to some degree by society for life? I think it's a matter of opinion and what we individually think of as justice. And having spent a lot of time reading the op-eds on both sides about Harvard revoking Gina's admission, I can say this is a topic that we as an American society are very much divided on. Thank you for listening. You can find Crimelines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.